Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you've been having great reads. I've been having some really good reads, starting with this one this week because we are reviewing one more book, and the book we're reviewing is Malice by John Gwynne. So yes, another week, another book review, another fantasy series started because we just cannot stop starting new series without finishing the previous ones that we started. So what is one more, right? Anyways, today we're reviewing Malice by John Gwynne. This has a awful glare, so we're gonna put it here so that you can see the cover better. But either way, Malice is the first book of a quartet called The Faithful and the Fallen. And I know in some videos I've said the bound and the broken, and that's just because these series that have these two words combined are getting me confused in my brain. So this is The Faithful and the Fallen. The Bound and the Broken are from Ryan Cahill, which is another amazing fantasy series, but completely different from this one. This is also an epic fantasy series, but this one is more centered in Nordic mythology, or not necessarily mythology from our world, but that Viking feeling, let's say. Not so much the typical Middle-earth type of fantasy. Malice was published in 2012, and when it was published, it received one of the big awards out there, which is the David Gemmell Awards, which, if you haven't read any David Gemmell, I totally recommend. Legend is an amazing book, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about Malice. So far, it has been able to gather 41,000 ratings on Goodreads, and it has an average score of 4.17 out of 5. And because this book has been acclaimed by many as a great epic fantasy, my curiosity was spiked, and so I decided to give it a try and read this book. But before we go into the actual review, you know the drill. We're gonna have a synopsis reading, and we're gonna have a timestamp here to just, if you want to skip that and not hear anything about the synopsis, then just go to that time. Otherwise, stick around. You'll be hearing me with the cover of this book, so you can have a bit more detail about it. And I think I've earned enough time for it, so let's go. The Vanished Lands has a violent past where armies of men and giants clashed in battle, and an easy peace reigns. But now giants stir once more, the very stones weep blood, and there are sightings of gigantic worms. Those who can still read the signs see a prophecy realized. Sorrow will darken the world as angels and demons make it their battlefield. Young Corbin watches it enviously as boys become warriors and yearns to join them, determined that he will make his family proud. It is only when everything he knows is threatened that he discovers the true cost of becoming a man. As the kings look to their borders and priests beg answers from the gods, only a chosen few note that the fate of the world will be decided between two champions, the Black Sun and the Bright Star. And with their coming will be a war to end all wars. Alright, now after this tense synopsis, without further ado, let's jump into our review. Starting with our plot, I gotta say, I kind of felt very proud of myself when I was reading this book because I could see the plot twist coming from the beginning. And maybe you're gonna say, well, the plot twist was kind of obvious from the start, so that's not really a great accomplishment. But for me it was. I thought it was very, very smart what John Gwynne did. I think John Gwynne was masterful in giving you just enough hints here and there, not being too obvious, and that together with red herrings to make you feel confused or unsure about your hypothesis. And then when you think you have your hypothesis all sorted out, suddenly certain parts start twisting and you start feeling more and more unsure about what you think is going to happen, which creates great tension, and it keeps you as the reader guessing about are you right, are you not, will this actually realize itself into what you're thinking, or is it going to be an even bigger plot twist? But the guarantee is that either way, you're going to be fully satisfied, even if you guessed it or not, because it's still a great adventure. And I can say, like, my opinion wavered as I was reading this book. I had a hypothesis at the start, and it kind of started shaking a bit as I progressed, but then eventually kind of solidified. I'm like, no, I believe this is going to happen, and it actually did. I think John Gwynne played really well with the chosen one tropes, and to make you believe that you know, and it's a familiar trope. You've read plenty of times about the chosen ones, but this one was done just slightly different for you to keep guessing and for you to actually wonder if everything that you read is what you think will be. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5. Moving on to characters, I have one big-ish criticism about characters, but I actually don't think it should be spoken in this section, so I'm going to refer it in the writing style. For now, I'll say that the people we get POVs from, which are mostly our main protagonists, I think were done brilliantly, especially for a first book of a series. And aside from that, we also get POVs from other characters that are not necessarily the protagonists that I think were also done very well. They were quite deep, they had personality, they had goals, fears, weaknesses, strengths, all of those. And even for side characters to feel quite explored for a first book, I thought was done brilliantly. And I mean, characters that don't necessarily get POVs, but we associate them through the main character's POV, we actually get a lot of detail in them. And that's really good because it makes the world feel more real. And I think that even though we have a big time gap, or not gap, a big time frame in this book, a lot of years go by in this book, we actually don't feel completely displaced like I felt, for example, in Jade Legacy. For me, was one of the big problems that so many years go by, and so the story kind of felt very episodic. But in this one, even though a lot of years go by, the story still feels continuous because we're constantly following the same characters going through one adventure, and you just see their growth, especially because the majority of the growth for one of the characters is in their childhood, so there's not much of a difference, and you progress to teenage years and then early adulthood, young adulthood, something like that. So I really enjoy the characters. I'm gonna give a 5 out of 5 for this category, but keep in mind that I will have something to mention in the writing style category. But before I jump into that category, let's talk about world building. This world is Nordic based, as I said before. There are things like giants, worms that look kind of like snakes slash dragons, not really dragons, but more like snakes. Think about Jormungandr, the big snake, I can't say their name. But I think overall, the lore and the background, the world itself feels quite original, quite fresh in the sense that it's not another medieval type of world. It feels like a completely separate world from ours. There's magic, there's some commonalities, but there's nothing that overlaps in itself. And I think even though there's not really a magic system per se, but the magic kind of takes a backseat, and it's mentioned here and there. There's some actions that kind of look like magic. It still feels very mystical and very mysterious as well in the world and how these powers can be used. One thing that I would have liked to see more, and maybe it will happen in the next few books, is knowing more about the giants. I know that in this first book they're pretty much portrayed as the one enemy, but my theory is that will change, and hopefully we'll be able to see more about their culture and what are their values, why things happen the way they did, and we get to this situation in this book that the giants are fighting the humans. Hopefully we'll be able to see the other side. That would be a good comparison with the humans. If we don't, then as long as John Gwynne writes it well, I think it will still be okay for me. And I mean, it won't be like necessary all the time. For example, in Lord of the Rings, we don't know the culture of the orcs, or in Wheel of Time, we don't know the culture of the Trollocs. There's always that enemy that is monstrous that you kind of just love to hate. But because the giants seem quite structured in societies and everything, I feel like we might have that possibility. But who knows? And the only other small thing that I have to mention is the emptiness in this world, because the cities and castles themselves, they feel very vivid, very well described. I can completely picture them in my mind. The spaces in between, they feel quite empty and abandoned, and I don't know if that was intentional or if this will be developed further on in the next books. But yeah, there was just that iffy detail about this book. Either way, for this category, world building, I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5. Now we reach writing style, and I bet you're curious to know what I was gonna say regarding characters. Maybe you already know if you watch my shorts, but I actually had a bit of troubles getting into this book at the start, and that was due to the sheer number of characters. And to add on that, also the multiple names for the same character. And I think if it were just that, it would be okay because I would get used to them as I progressed, like I do in all the books. But I think that matched with the fast pacing of the book at the start, it kept me always being a bit behind and keep forgetting and having to go back and forth to try and figure out who is who. But once I got the hanging of who was who and what characters were where, then the adventure really began, and it was a smooth sailing from there. And once it was like that, I was loving it. And besides, the prose is quite simple, direct, full of action, and I think if you enjoy battles, then you'll enjoy this book a lot. And I even think that this has a good reread value. I think if I read this book now, knowing what I know from reading it, I would still enjoy it. And I can imagine that if once I read the whole series, then reading this first book would have a lot more in it for me. So for me, this category will be a 3 out of 5. But I bet in the next book it will be much better. And finally, our last category, which is enjoyment. This category is quite confounded amongst everything because at the start of the book I was not enjoying, I was super confused. It was a bit of a slow read for me to get it going, but once I got it going, I was loving it, and towards the end I was really reading as fast as I could just to try and get to that ending. So there was a big contrast between the start and the end of the book. So for this category, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. But then again, I think the next book will probably be even better because I know now who the characters are. And as long as the plot and the character level stays high, then my enjoyment will probably also keep going high. And so we reached the end of this review. Just as a refresher, we have 5 for plot, 5 for characters, 4 for world building, 3 for writing style, and then a 4 for enjoyment, which gives us a final score of 4.2 out of 5. Again, it's very close to the Goodreads score. It seems like on average I have the same opinion as the people on Goodreads, but yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for this series to increase a lot, probably for 4.6, 4.8. It's just that the writing style at the start was a bit, and yeah, that kind of damaged both my enjoyment and everything else. But in terms of characters and plot, this was really good and I totally recommend it, especially because it has a new twist of the Nordic background and the giants and all of that. So it's quite cool. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this book. Now I want to know what you have to say. Have you read it? Have you not? Are you inspired to read something Nordic inspired, or do you prefer just the typical medieval kind of background? Let me know, comment down below, and if you're new, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and I hope I'll be seeing you on Thursdays and Sundays, okay? There.